This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. And here we go with the third part in the series exploring the roots of our modern health and wealth. So both of my previous guests, Oded Galor and Brad DeLong, agree that our modern prosperity is something relatively unique, something that was birthed around 150 years ago. It was not the inevitable outcome of a long rise in life quality throughout history. It was not the direct product of the Industrial Revolution. It was something quite sudden and something that has to be explained. And my guest today is the legendary economist Daron Acemoglu, perhaps the most influential economist alive. And Acemoglu agrees with much that has been said on the series so far. He agrees that our modern prosperity is not the outcome of a gradual ascent on the slopes of prosperity. He also agrees that modern prosperity did not start with the Industrial Revolution, but much later, something to be explained. But he differs on the explanation. So both of my previous guests, DeLong and Galore, blamed historic poverty largely on population growth. According to this so-called Malthusian trap, new tools, new farming methods rarely improve the life of the people because a better harvest simply led to more surviving children. So families grew, while the wealth of an individual within the family did not. Acemoglu disagrees, and he puts the blame on the elites. So as an example, Acemoglu cites the arrival of the windmill and watermill into medieval Europe. Really important inventions that we rarely really look back at, despite their relevance still today. And these should have been great things for the peasants, who should now have to work less with arched back, grinding the harvest into flour. Yet the peasants benefited very little. Instead of improving the life of the peasants, the increase in productivity in Europe was largely captured by the elites into, wait for it, building the famous cathedrals. And in France, for example, around 20% of the GDP was at one point dedicated to cathedral building. And Acemoglu thinks that this story about medieval windmills helps us think about modern prosperity more broadly today. So we became as rich as we did because we prevented elites from extracting all the gains of the modern economy. So as anyone who has read Acemoglu before, for example, his incredibly famous book, Why Nations Fail, knows, in his writings, politics explains economics, and this trend continues. There are some trends in what we discuss here which actually run counter my reading to Why Nations Fail, and I do in the second half of this episode press Acemoglu a little bit on whether he has changed his mind. But first, I will let him explain to you why he thinks that the modern prosperity was birthed in the second half of the 1800s.
I think a lot of people would say that when new technologies from windmills to steam engines, when they come on board, there is disruption. Some people lose their jobs. But at the end of the day, things will get better. All the boats will be lifted and prosperity will be shared. Does history support this view?
Yes and no. There are some very important episodes in which the disruptive negative effects of technology are seen, but ultimately things work out for the better. But the presumption that that was an automatic process is wrong. In fact, many people, when they say, look, things have worked out so well in the past, they have in mind the Industrial Revolution. But that's only a partial picture of what happened in the Industrial Revolution. For about 100 years, workers did not much benefit from it. From around 750 to around 1850, the real incomes of the working people in England does not seem to have increased much, and their working hours increased by about 20%. Their working conditions got much worse in modern factories where there was a lot more coercion, discipline, lack of autonomy, lack of flexibility. Working conditions were horrible, very noisy, very polluted. Children as young as 5 or 6 were working 18 hours a day in coal mines deep down, giving them a life expectancy of probably in their 20s. Infectious diseases went rampant. Pollution was unbearable. And there was no sign that any of this was automatically going to right itself. Today, if we are looking at a world in which, by and large, people have benefited from industrial technology, that is because institutions and the direction of technology started changing around the middle of the 19th century. Britain became a democracy. That was not a natural process. When the Chartists made some demands for one person, one vote in the 1840s, taking all measures to make sure that they did not appear radical, just making very reasonable demands that today we would find extremely normal and tame, they were able to collect 3 million signatures, 10% of the population, amazing amount of support from the people. And you know what their reward was? They were completely suppressed. All of their leaders were thrown in jail, and the elites did not even want to consider one single one of their recommendations. So democracy came out of a struggle. But with democracy, trade unions became legalized. Trade unions were prosecuted heavily under several laws. And of course, without trade unions, under such harsh conditions, women, children, working people were treated extremely harshly. So that started improving, wages started improving. And the direction of technological change altered quite significantly as well. Early technologies of the Industrial Revolution were all intended to automate work. So, not so much contributing to the workers' productivity and hence wages. In the second half of the 19th century, with more advanced industrial machinery, making workers more productive in factories, railway technology improving transport and the types of consumer and producer goods that were available in the market, worker productivity started increasing. And that was not, again, a inevitable process of technological way forward, but explicit choices by employers about how to use technology, how to develop technology. It was these transformative changes that ultimately brought us a modicum of shared prosperity, which then became the basis of 20th century growth.
What's fascinating about this is that I've had both Oded Galor and Brad DeLong on the podcast previously, and both have written books from very different angles, but they all agree with you on a very fundamental point, which is that when we look at the broad contours of history, it really seems that it just does not make that much of a difference whether you're a worker in ancient Egypt or pre-modern Venice.
Absolutely. I think that there is broad agreement on this, but the interpretation and the details of that are a little bit different. For example, I think many people are interpreting this through a Malthusian lens, but I think the data does not support that at all.
Well, let me quickly give the case for, so both Galore and DeLong take a somewhat Malthusian approach.
I think it's a problem. It's somehow something that is so attractive to economists, but I don't see the data supporting that.
Okay, well, let me make the case quickly. So what they would say is that in a patriarchal society before birth control, when you get extra technology, it can improve your living conditions for a while. But with the pressure to create male offspring, etc., and no birth control, you're just going to start having population increase. And therefore, you might get GDP growth, but you don't get GDP per capita growth. And as an example, there's data from when maize or new crops are introduced to various provinces in China. The ones that get them first get an increase in wealth, but in the long run, they just get increase in population growth. And Galore especially has a lot of data on this. So I don't want to say that Galore or DeLong definitely focuses also on the extractive elements of pre-modern world.
I mean, I think there are many points of agreement.
Okay, yeah, so exactly. So how deep is the disagreement?
Well, I think, if you take a really macro perspective and say you plot working people's income in a single graph for 10,000 years, it might look flat. But if you look at specific episodes, especially institutionally diverse environments, you will see very different changes. Of course, no society in the past has achieved sustained growth, meaning steady growth that's going to go on for a very, very long time. The technologies were not,
and we don't know if we are approaching that.
and we don't know. We've only been doing it for like 150 years or so. But take ancient Greece. There was a period of about 200 years in which real incomes grew, and there is no sign of Malthusian dynamics reversing that. If it was reversed thanks to Alexander the Great. But just if you're going to see Malthusian dynamics, you should also see them in the pre-state societies as well. But existing evidence suggests that they were in fact much better. They were offering much better conditions for regular people.
Okay, and your interpretation is that their elites were not as extractive.
Exactly. Well, you can of course say, those were not fully settled, and when they're not fully settled, perhaps they wouldn't have as many children. I mean, there are reasons, but I'm just emphasizing that having many children and all the surplus being extracted from the workers up to the level of some population growth, those are institutional outcomes. They're not, nature given.
Let's then look at the ways that DeLong and Galore interpret the change. I mean, the change happens in the latter half of 19th century, according to, I think, all of you three.
Yes.
Galore would take the most Malthusian approach, and he has a really interesting logic here,
Mhm.
which is that he really focuses on the demographic transition, the smaller family sizes,
Right.
and his story is that technology has been steadily improving,
Mhm.
but technology reaches a tipping point at the end of the
Mhm.
1800s,
Yeah.
after which it is actually important for the industrialists to have well-educated labor because you have to be able to count, you have to be able to read and write to work in the factories. And so actually it's not so much a political struggle as much as it is, according to him, the British industrialists and
Mhm.
other Western industrialists who lobby for public education. When they lobby for public education, they put a lot of pressure on the whole of society to start investing more heavily on fewer children rather than having a lot of children, which then begins the demographic transition. And indeed, when we look at rich countries today, whether East Asia or Western Europe, these are the places with very small family sizes. And so there's kind of two trends in here. One, there's the Malthusian trend, and then there is a very specific claim that actually this was not so much a political fight as much as this was a self-serving policy for the industrialists to start lobbying for public education. You can kind of approach it from either angle, but what would be your pushback?
The second part, I disagree very much. I think any objective reading of history cannot see anything consensual about how these institutions have changed,
Even with public education,
even with public education. Public education in Britain, for instance, came out of the democracy movement. And it is the same democracy movement that was originally very harshly suppressed. Now, the part that I agree with Oded is that ultimately schools are structured in a way that serves some of the needs of industrialists. That is a point that was originally made. I mean, somebody may make it before then, but I had originally read about this in a classic book by Samuel Bowles and Herb Gintis, which is a little bit more Marxian in its interpretation than mine, but it's a wonderful book called Schooling in America. But the main points that that book makes actually apply to Britain as well, that schools early on became a way of imparting values of obedience so that workers could fit into the factory system and so on.
or on a more positive note, also the fact that you start needing to be able to count and read and write would.
Right, exactly. But don't forget, industrialists were hugely happy to employ children for 80 years. 1840s, 1840s. This is a full 100 years after the introduction of advanced textile and steam mill machinery. Children, very young, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, are working in coal mines with no education, no protection. You know what they're doing? They're pushing carts, heavy carts loaded with coal with their heads. That was completely fine for employers. You know why that changed? Because the conditions were getting so bad that finally there was pressure, and Parliament had called these royal commissions to look into conditions of the working people who were dying and were sick all the time. And that was, the one of the triggers. It wasn't, employers coming together and saying, yeah, we want to sort of improve the education and human capital of workers.
Let's leave Galore aside and look at then DeLong's approach. I mean, DeLong sees the most important change being not political but technological. The way he explained to me was that around 1870s, you start having a dramatic change in the way business is done because of the Industrial Research Lab, which is incorporated into modern corporation. This is, Nikola Tesla is his poster boy for this. But the basic idea being that you start having a routinization of innovation. It's not just no longer geniuses, but it becomes a routinized part of everyday life. And with that, you have such a dramatic technological advancement that with technology basically changing every generation, you have such a dynamic society. You have so much creative destruction that you cannot have these kind of calcified elites that just sit on top of it all, because you just have so much more dynamism and you have so much more growth that there is more to share for everyone.
It is absolutely true, and I agree 100% that industrial R&D being done more professionally was important. But it's not the sort of linchpin of history. The application of scientific methods was very important, especially for heavy industry, chemicals, and so on. but you don't see that as a transformative turning point that suddenly everything becomes more shared. So, for instance, in the United States, there is the phase in which you have, you know, some very notable technological advances, for example, in railways, chemicals, and oil. But those are also the sectors that become highly monopolized. Those are the most conflictual sectors in some sense, where workers are repressed, politicians are bought and sold, rivals are intimidated, and that is not some sort of, oh, there is a lot of growth so we can all live happily. In fact, it's very conflictual, and it would have been a pretty disastrous turning point for the United States if that had remained that way. It's the progressive movements, muckrakers, media, and civil society organization that we owe our sort of recovery from that period with institutional and again technological changes.
But hold on a second. Didn't that period, this kind of Gilded Age, didn't it see, yes, massive inequalities? And yes, I completely, I think most people would agree that it would have been a disaster if it would just continue. But it did also start seeing wage growth for the average worker.
It's a small amount of wage growth we see during that period. But what is very important, and that's why I'm emphasizing it, it's not like, oh, there's a lot of technological innovation, so we have a lot, so the conflict lessens. Economics has changed a lot here. So I wouldn't say, Jim Robinson and I in our previous books and Simon Johnson and I in our current book are alone here. But many economists are still underappreciating and underemphasizing the importance of conflict. At every turn they try to find a way of minimizing conflict. So that's what I'm trying to emphasize, that conflict is key. And why is conflict key? Because choices are key. There's nothing automatic about this.
Okay, so that was the first part of this episode, which is really the part where we focus on the birth of modern prosperity. But I didn't want to end the show yet. In the second part, we focus more on recent developments. And in some sense, you might say that this is trivial to the historical quest. But I think that it's really not. The really big difference between Acemoglu and someone like Oded Galor, my guest in part one, is that Galor would say that technology is basically always a good thing. Except, of course, if population growth eats away its fruits in a Malthusian dynamic. So Galor is very optimistic. He has to be optimistic because if there isn't population growth, well, technological innovation is just going to benefit humankind. And since the demographic transition, we haven't really had population growth in rich countries. In many countries nowadays, we don't have population growth, which means that we're just going to be healthier and wealthier generation after generation. And Acemoglu disagrees. He thinks that there is nothing inevitable in new technologies actually improving human lives. They might only benefit some of us. They only benefit broader humanity if we order machines that indeed benefit the broader humanity. That's the key to understanding what he said so far, but it's also something that he thinks modern developments support, because it does not look like the recent technological developments, for example in the US, have really benefited the masses in the past 50 years. I will let him tell you why. But to preface this discussion, I will press him a little bit on how much what we've said so far is in contrast to his most famous book, Why Nations Fail.
But it is interesting because you brought your co-author James Robinson in, with whom you've written the book that will probably be the most famous amongst listeners, which is Why Nations Fail, a really wonderful book that I highly recommend to everyone. And it's a wonderful book. So is your new one, and I do see some tension.
Well, we evolve, don't we?
Yeah, we do. But let me make the not the DeLong, not the Galore, but the Acemoglu 10 years ago argument, as far as I could understand it, which is that we should be fine. We wouldn't have been fine throughout history in terms of technological growth. But that's because we lived in highly extractive societies. So a wonderful example of this comes from the windmills in the Middle Ages in your book, where when some common peasants want to build their own windmill, the abbot tells them that you're absolutely not allowed to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a highly extractive society, and therefore the common people cannot enjoy the benefits of technological progress. However, we now live in not perfectly inclusive societies, but for example, in the US or in Western Europe, we live in liberal democracies with all the kinds of things that Why Nations Fail as a book emphasizes: property rights, inclusive political institutions, relatively well-functioning democracies. Of course, we have a lot of flaws if we read the daily news, but from the broad sweep of history, of course, we live in deeply inclusive societies compared. And maybe now here, when you answer, you can maybe we can start moving and focusing more on your pessimism around the last 50 years, because I think that Why Nations Fail would have given me a much more optimistic view about where we would be going now, not about what medieval Europe looked like, but where the future is going, because that would have convinced me that it's enough to have technology plus these things like open markets, property rights, liberal democracy, and then we'll be happy ever after. So to the extent that there is a conflict there, and I am interpreting it right, how would you convince your past self that we're not going to be just rolling along?
Let me defend both perspectives in some sense, although it is true that my view and interpretation has changed a little bit. So Why Nations Fail is a more macro history. We're trying to explain, why the world is different today than it was in 1500, and why, say, Europe, Finland, Sweden, Germany, England are so much more prosperous than Latin America or Africa. From that macro perspective, I would completely agree with my earlier self that inclusive institutions are key. And one of the things that they do is actually allow technology adoption, and that technology adoption has been great. And looking again at from that macro perspective, I would say Silicon Valley is fantastic. Without Silicon Valley, you wouldn't have had the same level of entrepreneurship, risk taking, and innovativeness in the United States. But once we zero into our current episode, it's not just the technological change that becomes central, but it's the direction of technology. Then, looking at the history from that point of view, you also see the direction of technology being quite a significant factor in other episodes as well. So, in that sense, at the macro perspective, Why Nations Fail omitted the important critical role of the direction of technology. So the common thing about Why Nations Fail in my current perspective is that in both uh, approaches, in both books, the power structure matters. Who has the power to control technology? But in Why Nations Fail, the most important aspect that we emphasize is whether you allow those innovations or whether you try to set up and live with a coercive structure.
Because the elites are better off without a dynamic economy.
Sometimes they are afraid of technology. Sometimes they don't see the need. Sometimes they see it as destabilizing. So those were the things that we emphasized in Why Nations Fail. Was that the full picture? No. Did I think at the time that was the full picture? No. But now I see it as more important to have also dwelled on the direction of technology. But there's one other difference, and let me come back to that, which is again something that Jim and I were somewhat aware, but my thinking has evolved on this. Looking at Latin America, where for most of its history coercion has been rampant, and Africa to Asia, if you asked us about power, which also part of the subtitle of Why Nations Fail, we would have emphasized economic, political, and military power. But today, Simon and I argue, that persuasion power is even more important than tanks and armaments. This is why Silicon Valley is a mixed blessing. It's the environment, it's the risk-taking and entrepreneurship hub, but at the same time, it has become a dominant persuasive power over society, imposing its view of digital technologies, its view of future of technology, future of work, and making us complacent about inequality. And that I see as very dangerous. And let me give you one example of what I mean by that. We just mentioned the progressive movement and how they reversed the whole of the robber barons. You might say they did something that was much harder. It should be much easier to do today because they didn't have direct democracy. Senators were not directly elected, and they were one of the biggest supporters of the robber barons because that's where they got their money for election or into their pockets. The federal government had no tools. There was no Federal Reserve, no income tax, no regulatory tools. It's very different from today. They did it then. We should be able to do it now. But actually, there's one big difference. I think the tech sector's persuasive power is much greater than what the robber barons ever had.
Interesting. So Standard Oil was broken up, but Facebook isn't, partially because tech optimism that has become, in a way, part of our ideology.
Mhm.
And I mean, I think for me, when thinking about whether the techno-optimism works or not, whether we should be techno-optimists or more pessimists, I think one of the most striking things that I learned from your work is that real wages of a lot of people have been going up in, for example, the US for the past 50 years, but not for men without university education.
Well, actually, I emphasize men without a college degree or men with a high school degree because they are, the most striking.
They basically haven't had any wage growth.
They've had a wage decline, but it's not some people. 60% of the U.S. workforce does not have a college degree, and on average, that group has had zero or very little wage growth for about 50 years.
And you have calculations suggesting that, do I remember right, that maybe 2/3 of this is because of automation, 1/3 because of globalization?
Yeah, something like that. And look, I mean, I think that's a really striking number.
The problem, I mean, I think that it's easy for anyone listening to agree. And just looking at the political consequences, of course, we can see how difficult the situation is. But what is the alternative? Because you're not break the machine, let's go back to Stone Age kind of person.
Oh, absolutely not. I am an optimist. Look, I'm an optimist for the following reason. So let's see. So this is the On Humans podcast. So this is a really important part of the argument. First of all, every time you question anything that is being done in the current technological field, every time you question Silicon Valley, you are accused of being a Luddite.
Yeah, machine breaker.
I am not a Luddite, even though I think, the history of the Luddites is completely misinterpreted. Luddites were not just break the machines, they were trying to complain about the way in which the machines were being used. But let's leave that aside. I am not saying we should block technological change. Far from it. I think technological change has been an engine of prosperity and will be an engine of prosperity if we use it right. If you want an analogy, those who say block the technology are like trying to stop the flow of a river. That's both inadvisable and very, very difficult. What I'm saying is let's redirect some of the flow towards places where it will do less damage and it will create more social good. And I have a very specific way in which I think we should conceptualize the social good from technology. Unfortunately, this is a word Simon and I do not use in the book. We should have, but I would summarize it as saying a pro-human direction of technology. And what I mean by pro-human is technological changes that are complementary to humans, that increase their capabilities, increase their information, their decision-making capability, their agency, their productivity, rather than sidelining them. Automation is something that's going to go on forever. I'm completely in favor of automation, but not when the only thing you do is automation. Because if you automate work and you don't do anything else, where do humans go? No, if you look at successful periods in which shared prosperity was built, you see a lot of automation, but you also see a lot of new tasks and new responsibilities for humans. That's what we should do.
And how do we do that?
I'll come back to that. But if you look at periods in which humans are cast aside, their agency is reduced, their autonomy is reduced, those are often sad periods, like the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. When you take people's decision-making capacity, when you turn them into cogs in the machine, that's not what's pro-human. You give them more choices, better decision-making capabilities, better information. If you manipulate humans, they don't become good citizens. They don't become good Democrats. You have to use technology not in an anti-democratic way, but in a pro-democratic way. Actually, if you look from the outside, perhaps that's how it appears from Helsinki, and that's how many people from DC and New York interpret it. They look at Silicon Valley and they see, these are very globalist, pro-democratic people. But I would actually say the general tendency in Silicon Valley is anti-democratic. Why? Because they do not appreciate the unique, versatile skills of humans. They see humans as fallible, making mistakes, needing to be steered by geniuses or by machines. That is not a pro-human direction. I don't think a society in which we do not respect, value, and enable the work that people who work with their hands do, is going to be a happy society. An electrician, a carpenter, a gardener is as much doing a valuable, useful work as you and I sitting in our offices and doing mental work. But right now, we are giving you an amazing set of tools. Look at the tools that you have available at your fingertips for recording, for reaching the world.
Yeah, it really is wonderful.
And what about the electricians? We're not giving them anything. We're not giving them any tools. There are tremendous needs in the United States and in Europe for more and more electrical work. But we're not training electricians. We're not giving them any tools to identify problems, more complex problems in real time. We can do those easily. We can make them better decision maker, more informed, better trained. We're not doing that. So AI, artificial intelligence, and digital technologies, they are actually amazing tools for increasing human capabilities. That's not how we are using them. And that's because of this anti-democratic mindset in Silicon Valley.
And I think wonderful example of that is when Elon Musk said that he himself made a mistake trying to only use as much robots as possible.
Exactly. Well, at least Elon Musk admitted it.
Yeah, and he literally said humans are underrated.
Yes. Well, he said
And-
that, but then he's continued to, doing some
Yeah.
of the same things, but at least he admitted it.
And you would say that Germany here provides a better path. In Germany, you see more use of robots than in the US in, for example, car manufacturing, but in a way that you say is actually conducive to people still working there with the robots. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are many things. I don't want to eulogize Germany. There are many things that are not sufficiently risk taking in Germany. There are problems in the service sector and the supply chain in Germany. But for the big part of the manufacturing industry, you see German firms much better at using human skills. Why? First of all, labor is scarce in Germany. Just like in the 19th century in the United States, scarce labor becomes valuable. They do better. They have unions and work councils that provide an institutional basis for more pro-human directions of technology. They have a wonderful training system that prepares people to have a variety of job-specific, industry-specific skills, so they become more valuable to the companies. So rather than just sideline them, they train them even more. They turn them into technical employees.
It's a wonderful idea. I mean, I never thought of unions in this way of how they can create unions and labor rights can create a kind of virtuous circle where if you have invested in them and if it's not easy to just sack them, you find ways to complement them rather than sidelining them.
Absolutely. But again, let me warn you, you are right not to have thought of it this way, because if you look at the UK and the United States, unions have often not played that role because union management relationship has been conflictual enough that more cooperative role has not emerged. But if you look at your own country, Finland, if you look at Sweden, you see more of that, and you see that in Germany.
Very interesting. Okay, last question. All the wonderful work that you've done throughout the years, thank you so much for it. And how has that shaped your outlook on our species?
I think that's a wonderful question. Thank you, Ilari. And I think that 20 years ago, I would not have known how to answer this question. At least now I have an answer. And I think the answer to me is that we have not fully appreciated and celebrated the amazing diversity, creativity, adaptability, and unique, versatile skills that humans have. It is such an amazing outcome of evolution and institutional innovations and adaptations that we have built amazing societies with a very rich cultural diversity. And I would like to emphasize this point because there are two sets of currents that I think undervalue those skills. One is the drive for autonomous machine intelligence, especially now fueled with generative AI, which sidelines humans, undervalues humans, puts them not in the driver's seat, but in the back seat at the best of conditions. And the second, again, this sort of ideological current that puts people who work with their minds miles ahead of people who work with their hands. It's really the combination of hand and mind, our ability to reason and interact with the physical world that is so special about us, and that creates all that versatile diversity and enables many, many, many millions of us, billions of us to contribute to our very rich world and that we have built in the 21st century. So I think celebrating that great skills and versatility of humans is a central thing for the future.
Professor Daron Acemoglu, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ilari. It was a great conversation.
Okay, so that was it for today. Thank you for listening until the very end. And I hope that you decide to tune into the final episode of The Birth of Modern Prosperity, this one with Branko Milanovic. And Milanovic is a scholar of inequality who will help us understand and tease apart the various ways in which inequality has indeed reduced during this era of modern prosperity, as Acemoglu suggests. But of course, the story is not as straightforward as that. We'll talk about the ups and the downs, the reasons behind them, and I hope that you tune in to learn more and get more food for thought about inequality and equality during the era of modern prosperity. Until then, take care.